This is Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany. Inspiring and providing real insight to our listeners with every story. Exploring deep stories behind every guest. Please welcome your host, Bo Tiffany.
Hey, Robert. Thanks for coming back to Digital Voices. How you doing today?
I'm doing terrific, Bo, and always delighted to be with you.
I'm excited. What are we talking about today?
Digital listeners, Bo and I have a very interesting podcast for you today. We call it The Red Light in Your Head. It's about an idea that can literally save your life. Today's pod is about how to recognize your internal reaction to situations that everyone, including you, will inevitably face in your life, where if you forge ahead and continue on the path you're going, that decision could easily and often does result in disastrous or at least bad consequences. We will discuss here how to recognize your better judgment, telling you not to go forward, and the most common rationalizations that we all tell ourselves in our heads for ignoring what our better judgment is warning us about. I'm going to use the term red light in this podcast, but it's a metaphor. There is no red light, as you know. It's a reference by analogy to those lights on a car, your car dashboard, that come on when something's wrong. Like, for example, you have a check oil light, and it tells you that your oil is low and cautions you to stop and add more oil. If you ignore that light and keep driving, and your car actually runs out of oil, your car motor will experience severe damage. So the way I'm going to use the term red light here is synonymous with the notion of your inner voice or your better judgment. And perhaps there are other phrases that capture the gist of this idea. But I'll use the red light here because to denote that uncomfortable, foreboding feeling that we all get when we feel that we're heading toward danger. Each of us has that metaphorical red light in our heads. Quote goes on when we feel we're headed on a path where if we continue or don't do something different, something bad could happen. And this is our mind's way of warning us of this danger and urging us to take protective action. So let's get concrete here with some examples. Imagine that you're walking on an open golf course fairway with some of your friends are playing golf, and you notice there's some dark clouds gathering out there in the distance. Those clouds are still pretty far away. So you keep playing golf. Then a little later, you notice those dark clouds are much closer, but still not over you yet, still way off in the distance. So you decide to continue to play golf and play the next hole. Then a little later still, you suddenly see a flash of lightning. And a few seconds later, you hear this loud clap of thunder. And from these dark clouds that are now nearly on top of you, and you realize that the lightning is heading straight toward you. At this point, if it hasn't already, the red light has gone on in your head. Your better judgment is telling you something along the lines of people are killed every year from lightning. So we should immediately get off this open golf course fairway where we could be struck by that lightning and quickly move to a safe place, like in the clubhouse. Almost always at this point, at the time the red light first comes on, you've got choices. You can listen to your better judgment and you could heed the red light and go to safety, or you can ignore it and continue ahead up the fairway, exposed and vulnerable to the lightning. And that is, in fact, what most of those who are actually struck by lightning did. They ignored the red light. They did not seek safety. They kept going. In a number of cases, as we all know, they died as a result of that decision. The same exact principle, of course, applies to those who are struck by lightning, whether on mountains or golf courses or open fields or beaches or anywhere that they're exposed to lightning. They ignored the red light. Not everyone who is struck by lightning dies. Many have survived, but they're left with permanent neurological damage. And nearly all of those people who were struck by lightning would be alive and uninjured today if they had heeded their own red light. It's as simple and as tragic as that. But the good news is that, again, there's a valuable lesson in here for all of us that, if heeded, can literally save our lives. This concept is applicable to a wide array of circumstances, as there are many arenas and varied activities in our lives that are potentially dangerous, and where, if we're heading into danger, the red light will come on in our heads. Whether or not we heed our better judgment in those situations, whether we turn away from danger or continue for it, will play a determinative factor in our ultimate safety. So let's concentrate again and get concrete. I'm sorry, Bo, you have a question?
Yeah. So, I find that there's two types of people: the adrenaline junkies, if you will, the people that thrive on that thrill. Do you find that there's maybe a higher percentage of people pushing the red line amongst personality types?
That's a fascinating question. And there's a whole lot of research and speculation and stuff. I mean, most of the people who get into trouble, whether it's lightning or mountain climbing or a host of other things, including getting in trouble flying, are men as opposed to women. And so that are off the bat here, in response to your question, there is some psychological component here. And it's hard to say where it goes. Some people are just more reckless than other people. And I think we all go into this analysis knowing that. And so the purpose of it here, and the purpose of this podcast, is to help us recognize this concept, recognize this red light in our heads. And this is probably the most important part of the podcast, recognize the rationales that we tell ourselves in our head that enables us to ignore this. I'll talk more about this in a minute, but it goes off in everybody's head, but some people ignore it and continue on. Why? We will discuss that, and hopefully in a way that will enable us to recognize and heed and not follow that course. Okay. Now, let's take a concrete example here. Okay. And let's consider you're driving on a road and you're moving into low visibility. And there's increasing ground fog. It's interfering with your ability to see far enough ahead to drive safely and to avoid oncoming traffic. At this point, or somewhere along this point, everybody's red light's going to go on. Now, you would think that everybody would stop when the fog gets so bad that it blocks your ability to drive safely. But sadly, as with lightning, we all know there are many who ignore this increasing danger, ignore the red light, and insist on blindly driving in the dense fog. And many of them predictably and tragically go on to die or be injured in the resulting fiery car crashes. It happens everywhere, all over the world, and you read about it in newspapers and you see it on TV, and I know you're familiar with that. Now, while the red light goes on, you're headed into clear and extreme danger. There are other times in our life, in our daily lives, where we're exposed to some level of danger, but it's not an extreme. And in our understanding of the role of our better judgment and the red light, it's critical to understand the concept of unreasonable risk and how risk is managed, okay? So let's start by acknowledging that there's some risk, some unavoidable risk in every human activity. You can be laying in your bed and still be killed by an airplane falling through your roof. Okay, it happens, and you read about it. So risks cannot be eliminated, all of them, but it can be managed. And this is an important distinction and insight we need to bear in mind. So when we think of risk, we don't need to think of it as something that we can avoid, because you can't, but it's instead something to be managed. Our job is to be constantly alert and make choices to avoid unreasonable risk, especially if there are alternatives. And that's what managing risk means. Okay, to help understand this, let's apply some more things here to ordinary life. Okay, you want to drive to the grocery store. Okay, now we all know that there's some risk associated with the 2-mile drive to the grocery store. If you do a really deep analysis, you'll determine that in America we have a fatal accident, a car accident, every 100 million miles of average. And so if you drive a couple miles to the grocery store, there's a risk to that. There's a risk. There's a calculable, eternal, quantifiable risk that you'll be killed going to the grocery store. But what is that risk? It's one in hundreds. It's 100 million or so. It's so much you could do it every day for hundreds of thousands of years and never even come to a 50% chance that you'd be killed. So an analysis of risk needs to take in the benefit, okay? Benefit versus the risk. Now, this is pretty simple, okay? And this is how doctors and lawyers and scientists and economists address risk. They weigh the activity and that we're contemplating, and they compare it with the benefit, okay? It's very simple. It's exactly what the Food and Drug Administration does when they weigh the risk of a new drug, okay? They take the risk of harmful side effects, maybe even fatal side effects, and they compare it to the benefits of the drug. If the benefits are substantial, like a vaccine, and the risk of serious side effects are remote, the drug is considered, quote, safe, okay? The FDA's analysis is very simple. It's risk versus benefit. If the risk is small and the benefit is huge, the drug is safe. Behavior can be analyzed by exactly the same analysis. Okay. For example, and it gets interesting if the risk becomes enormous. Okay. For example, there's some really interesting, just theoretically, that let's say you have cancer and you have the kind of cancer that's going to kill you, 100% fatal cancer. You're going to die in 30 days if you don't take this drug. And the drug itself has a 50% fatality rate. Are you going to take it? Is it safe? Well, you just measure 100% chance of fail versus a 50% chance that if you take this drug, it will cure the cancer and you'll live. It's a safe drug. That's an extreme example. Okay. We don't often encounter that in real life, but it shows the concept. Okay. So it enables us, if we use this now, to calculate whether a course of action is reasonable. If the risk of death is tiny, the risk of death is serious, and the benefits are superfluous, like finishing a round of golf is the benefit, okay? And the risk is being struck by lightning, okay? The choice is clear. The risk is unreasonable under the circumstances. So get off the golf course and get out of the reach of the clubhouse, out of lightning, okay? This is where the red light concept can be a lifesaver, okay? Because we're often confronted in our lives by situations where we find ourselves following a path that's leading us into increasing danger, unreasonable risk. And at that point, we have a choice. We can abort the course of action that we're on and avoid danger, or we can continue on and remain on the path of danger. This is an extremely important decision-making process at the heart of each of us living a safe and long life. And it is the insight at the heart of this podcast. If you follow this common sense insight, if you heed the red light in your head, it will contribute to your living a long and safe life. So let's talk some more about concrete, practical applications, okay?
Before we get there, let me interject a little bit.
Please.
There's a movie called Rush. Have you heard of it yet? It's with
I've heard of it, but I have not seen it.
It's a Ron Howard movie, and it's got Chris Hemsworth in it, or Hemsworth, and it's based on a 1970s rivalry between two race car greats. Niki Lauda, if you're familiar with him.
No, he's a race car driver, right?
Yeah, and
okay,
quite good. But he was very calculated and very aware of his red light. And he was put into a situation where he said in an interview, every time I get on the track and race, there's a 20% chance I won't be coming home. And he was put into a position where they were on a crappy F1 track over in Europe. It was raining out. The track conditions were horrible. He ended up wrecking and was burned over a substantial, large part of his body. Before he was even done with recovery, he still managed to race his final race because he was trying to keep this championship. It's a really great movie that I saw recently, but it reminded me a lot of what you were talking about, and it's knowing that there's a percentage of everything in life and you're willing to mitigate a certain amount of risk. But when you think it through, how much risk or percentage of risk are you willing to take on?
That's at the heart of determining what is reasonable. Mountain climbers divide up risk climbing in two types of risks. There's subjective risk, which is the risk that you won't tie your knot right or you'll slip. And there's objective risk, which is something you can do nothing of, that the mountain will decide to collapse above you and the glacier will bury you and you'll have an avalanche or something. And you may decide, as race car drivers do, that you will go into that risk zone and you will climb that mountain, even though there's a 20% chance that you'll be killed, by the avalanche or by in the risk of the. That is a different analysis. That's an intentional choice to encounter objective risk. What we're talking about here is for us laymen, us ordinary people, as we go through life, we can elect to do the race or climb under the hanging ice fall, but most of the time we're just out, living our lives, and the benefit of taking this risk is kind of superfluous and it's foolish. And we would do much better and live longer lives if we bring this concept to bear and ask ourselves, is this a reasonable risk? Are we aware of it? Is it worth it? Okay. So I am, as you know, a pilot and an avid mountain climber, and both of these activities involve a substantial amount of risk management, where the proverbial light has a great role to play. And I think there's much to learn about how those who engage in these activities seek to educate others who engage in those activities about ways to avoid the thinking processes and the rationales and the wishful thinking that leads to otherwise experienced and sophisticated people to ignore the red light and pay the ultimate price for doing that. So I can't emphasize enough here, as you guys are all thinking about this, that the red light applies to all manner of situations, and so not just mountaineering and aviation where there's risk, but floods and fires and being robbed and not being able to find your car and storms and getting too close to a volcano or walking too close to a grizzly bear in Yellowstone. There's an unlimited list of these things.
Sometimes we might overemphasize our abilities. We're more confident in our abilities than we actually are able to bring to the table. Or are we just liking to ride the edge of the knife, adrenaline rush?
That's another excellent question. It goes to the heart of this, and I'll go into it in a few minutes here. There's so many private pilots that do small planes crash every year, and it's just carnage just going on for decades. And finally, the FAA got sick of it, and they brought in experts, and they tried to figure out what processes go on in the minds of pilots to do these things that we look up and say, how reckless, almost suicidal it was. Why did they do that year after year? What are they thinking? And they got into that, and with the idea of adding that, and they did, to the training of pilots and to the exams, both practical and written, and teach pilots how to recognize these things so that they will not fall victim to them and not do it. Okay. But one of them is, the FAA asks you to list, and I'll get to that. You actually put your finger on one of them that's actually in the FAA experts analysis. I'm better than everybody. Accidents happen to other people. All these rationalizations that get people, and there is, I think, maybe wrong to say it as an addiction to adrenaline or an affinity for it, or some people just like pushing the corners and the edges and the envelope, and I'm sure that is a factor as well. Okay. But we who are normal people need to take that into account too. Are we, even if we are one of those people, are we just pushing the envelope for the thrill of it? Is it worth it? Are we subjecting ourselves, our families, our friends to an unreasonable risk that we will come to regret this deeply? Okay. If you ask those that were injured in those situations, in these pilots or the people, why did you go on to do what you did? And why did you ignore it? And they will give you this variety, these rationalizations that they went through. And you asked me about people getting over their heads. There was analysis by the national parks about, why do so many thousands of people have rescued? 6 people die every week in national parks in the United States. Who are these people? Well, 81% of them are men. But why did they get there? And so I looked at some analysis of this, and some of them fell, okay, but 42% had to be rescued because they were simply hiking and got lost. 13% were camping overnight and got lost and missing. Another cause is inadequate physical condition. They were exhausted, they were over their heads that way. Insufficient or error of judgment. They didn't know that they couldn't make this, or there were other problems, or, darkness is 6%, inadequate clothing or equipment, 8%. So a majority of all the people that get into trouble in these national parks do so because they made just their common ordinary people. These were not people hanging by their toenails up on some cliff. These were normal people who just didn't listen to their own red lights. Okay. If we look at this, we come to the inescapable conclusion that they just, did this because they ignored their red lights. And pilots are perhaps the worst in this thing for their crashes, and the FAA, for years and years, they and the pilot associations and the insurance companies that insured them just watched year after year where pilots did the exact same stupid things. Okay, what are those stupid things? They flew into thunderstorms. Even jet fighters don't fly into thunderstorms. They flew into known icing with no anti-icing. They flew into weather forecasts that predict heavy fog. They even flew on when they could look down and see the fog forming. And you don't have to be a pilot to know that you can't land a plane in the fog. You can't see the runway. You can't see anything. And if you can't see anything, you will run into buildings, trees, or mountainsides, and that's usually fatal. But still, these pilots looked down and they could see the fog forming, and they did not land. What were they thinking? The red lights had to be blazing in their heads. And there's an ultra depressing final statistic here that 18% of all the small plane accidents in the United States, 50 crashes last year, were caused by nothing more than these pilots running out of gas. So not only were they ignoring the red light in their head, but they ignored the flashing fuel light that says fuel warning, low fuel, and it was flashing in the face as well, and he just kept going. Okay, so after some, putting up with this, the insurance companies have for years and years gnashing their teeth at this carnage, they got together and they decided to change pilot training, as I was mentioning, and they did it, and they changed the written tests. They changed the practical tests. We get in with a licensed flight examiner, and you have to pass an exam to get a license. And so before they did this, they rounded up all these behavioral experts, and they sat down. They said, we want to understand the pilot's internal rationales, what were they thinking inside their heads when they made these decisions that looked to us on the ground to be inexplicably reckless and suicidal. And this was done so they could make these changes, which they did. Okay. And the goal was to teach pilots to recognize and reject these dangerous rationales and thinking processes that go on in their head, which lead them to make these bad decisions. Okay. They sought to teach them in these how to recognize and avoid 5 key thought patterns. Okay. And so I'm on the FAA website here, and I just read you some of the ones they came up with. This is not an exhaustive list. The first one is, you can't tell me what to do. Okay. A lot of people have this anti-authoritarian streak in themselves that, I know what to do. I know better. And I know it says do this, but I'm okay. I'm better. And so the teaching is to show people what the basis for these rules, how they're usually right, what causes people to die, and that they should follow the rules. The rules are right. The next one was do it quickly. And this is another interesting thing, that it is not just in aviation. People get into trouble, especially on the trail. They get lost, they panic, and they decide they have to do something immediately. And usually the decision they make is worse than the situation. I remember I had a judge once that told me in a settlement conference, I had a client who was kind of unreasonable. And he said, look, as dire as you may think your situation is right now, it is always possible to make it worse. And that is what as what they tell people, that when you can be up someplace and so people have, I'll give you an example in the desert, in Death Valley, the summer heat just kills people. I mean, it's so hot, and so the Park Service has all these warnings. If your car fails, you run out of gas, you have car trouble, stay in your car. All the trails, all the roads are patrolled. They'll come and get you. Stay there. But no, people have to make that decision. They get out of their car. They don't know which way safety is. They leave their car and they head off into the desert or up some canyon, and the FAA finds their bodies there, and they find their car quickly, but there's nobody in there. And so there's an example of this impulse, which arises in all kinds of situations. We have to do something immediately and not think it through, okay? And the other one is, it can't happen to me. You've probably seen that. People think that accidents happen to other people, not me. And if something good happens to me, it's because I'm smart. If it happens to other people, or something bad happens to me, it's luck. And so, the FAA teaches people it can happen to you. And then there's the I can do it, which is something along the lines you were talking about earlier, that I'm better than all these other pilots. I don't need these rules. I can do it. And then they teach people, taking these chances is foolish, and look what happens to people. And the final one that the FAA is major list here is the what's the use analysis. Some people believe that, if you get into trouble or whatever you do, it doesn't make any difference. There's a kind of a fatalistic view that people have that, if I do the right thing, it doesn't necessarily make it work. So I'm not really in charge of my fate. And so they try to teach people more of an existential view that you're not helpless, and that you can make a huge difference. You're in charge. Take responsibility. And so those are the ones the FAA came up with. And I have a couple others that I have encountered often. Okay, one of them is what the pilots call get-there-itis. Okay, and get-there-itis is something that happens to pilots and drivers as well. And the pilot feels like he's got to be there. So, he's got to be home. His family's waiting. He's got an important event, a wedding, a funeral, a court appearance. And so they push their luck and they take reckless risks, continuing on to get there, even in the face of tyranny, weather, and other dangers. And there's a version of get-there-itis that happens in mountains, okay? And we call this summit fever, okay? And summit fever happens when the climbers are invested days and days climbing and struggling, and the summit is right. It's right there. You could just see it. It's just and so it's tantalizingly close. And so they're running out of time. The weather's deteriorating, and there's all kinds of risks. They promised to turn around at 2:00, and now it's 3:00, and they're still going up. And under the influence of summit fever, climbers take reckless risks. They continue on. That's what happened to all those guys that got killed on Everest. They promised to run at 2:00, and at 6:30 they're still climbing. And so, but they got stuck in a huge storm, and it happens. And so climbers will deviate up dangerous cliffs and do all kinds of things. In the end, the decision, it proves to be deeply fatal. And I have to confession, I had an experience like this. And you see this background behind me. That's Mount Tyndall. It's a 14. I climbed that once, but I took this picture when I climbed Williamson, which is over here on my right. The left of your side there is the second highest mountain in California. And I came and I climbed it. My climbing partner couldn't make it, so I ended up climbing it alone. And it's a 35-mile climb. And I climbed up to 10.5 on an area behind here and camped there. Then I got up at 2 a.m. and took off like crazy and to run for the summit. And I got all the way up and I had read about this, and some people said it was third class, and some people you can climb up without risk of falling. And others said, no, it's fourth class. Don't do it. Fourth class is if you fall, you die, and it's exposure to cliffs. Well, I get up there and it's at 14,000 feet. And I'm the summit. I'm spent days. I've invested it. And so I have to confess, I fell under the influence of summit fever. And I went on and I kept looking up, and I found places for my hands, and I went on up, summited, signed the register, and I come back down. And, you can climb stuff up that you can't climb down. Why? Because you can't see where to put your hands and feet. That's why people get stuck, because they're going up there, but they can't get down. Doesn't follow as you can get down. So here I am, I'm back, it's starting to it's late, it was just right before I took this picture coming down. And I couldn't see where to, and so I climbed back up and went around this cliff and stood on this little ledge and just looked down, tried to memorize where everything was and put this in my head. Spent 30 minutes just charting it. Went back and started back down. And there were a couple moments there where, I looked down between my legs and, it's 10 stories down to this flat thing right underneath me. And I thought, what the heck am I doing here? This is stupid. And I should never do this again. I resolved it, and I haven't done it again. I've hired guides to keep me from summit fever, and they belay me on ropes, so this can't happen again. But I fell victim to it, and I put myself in a position of extremely unreasonable risk that could have killed me. And if I had died, it would be because the red light was on, flashing, and I ignored it with all these rational. I can do this, okay. And there's one final
brings up a question. Point. Yeah. So I was wondering if there's maybe a particular age group that this is more prone to, but the more I listen to you and your presentation, the more I get the feeling that it doesn't really matter on an age group necessarily. It can happen to someone that's 70. It can happen to someone that's 20.
Well, I was 71, so yes, it can happen. I don't see an age thing. The thing, young people, we think of them as more impetuous, but it's easier for young people to say, I'm not experienced enough, or I'm not that level. It's easy without saving face, without losing face, and that's one of the things that on the other paradox of that is among experienced mountain climbers, if you turn back right before the summit, that's considered an example of sound judgment. That's praiseworthy, okay? And if you just recklessly go on that's not praiseworthy. So young, less experienced people, I don't know how the age anything to do with it, less experienced people will, in those situations, make reckless decisions more often because they think that the failure to summit is a negative statement about their character, their courage, and all this kind of their abilities, rather than seeing it as a sound judgment. Okay, and there's one other little internal rationales that everybody should on the lookout for, and that's one I called, when the weather's getting bad, the road's getting icier, the lightning's heading this way, and it's getting late. People say, well, let's just go a little bit further and see what happens. It might get better. Okay, that's a very common rationale. It gets people into a lot of trouble. And the final rationale is that other people are doing it too. Okay, we humans tend to look around. If everybody else is doing it, no matter how stupid it is, we'll do it and not question ourselves. And the number one place that comes from is driving in fog. Driving on icy roads. I used to represent. I'm a retired lawyer. I used to represent the California Auto Body Association, the guys with 5,000 garages, and Christmas came early for them in December when that first snow came in the Sierras and all these flatlanders went up there to the mountains. And did they slow down when they got on the icy roads and the fog? No, they went faster. Why? Because everybody else was doing it too, And so I think that played a big role and they would get in these crashes and they would tow the cars down or they would drive to all these smashes. And these guys would be full of business and Christmas come early. And they were just waiting for that first deal. So all these are these internal rationales and thinking that we have to look out for ourselves, that they don't happen to us, okay? And we recognize them, and we turn back when we see those situations happening, and we don't allow ourselves to be enticed by these various, rationales, which we just went through to go forward, okay? So here, Digital Voice listeners, in plain sight, is a potentially life-saving and more often grief-saving concept, one that you should try to remember and take pains to heed when it happens to you, when your red light goes on. The takeaway is that this can not only save your life, but it can save the lives of those with you who are passengers in your car, who are playing golf with you on the golf course, or in a myriad other instances where the red light comes on, and you can urge your companions to join you in withdrawing from danger and seeking safety. So whenever and wherever you feel uncomfortable with where you're headed or what's your course of action or current situation or circumstances, the first thing for you to do is stop. And I have an acronym for this whole thing. It's the first thing you do is stop, and you listen to your inner voice. It's SAT, S-A-T, stop, assess, carefully consider your situation and the alternatives available, and take the best alternative and retreat to safety. Now let's go into a little more depth on these three. Okay, stop. Don't continue into danger. Don't rationalize or excuse or engage in wishful thinking, and don't indulge yourself in the get-there-righters or summit fever, which is dwelling on the consequences of being late or not getting there. Don't do that. Stop. Okay. Next is get out, move immediately into a position or circumstance of safety, at least as much as possible. For example, if you're on an icy road or one with diminishing visibility from fog, get off the highway completely and park in a safe place well out of the way of traffic. Never, ever, ever park on the shoulder of the highway. That's where most people get killed in fog. Assess after you've stopped and placed yourself in a safe place, then carefully and thoughtfully consider your next step. Avoid the temptation at all costs of feeling that you must make an immediate decision about what to do. What you should do, you don't have to do something right away. And that impulse leads to very bad decisions, and that leads to very bad outcomes. So take as long as it takes. Have something to eat, relax, get out of the car and stretch your legs. Don't be afraid to spend the night in your car. Wait, and don't resume your journey until it is safe to do so. At this point, I have a vivid memory to share. I was once heard an NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board investigator who investigated plane crashes. And he was speaking to a group of us pilots, okay, at a convention. And he related how he's often the first person to arrive at accidents, usually early in the morning. And there, he often finds a smoking hole in the ground with an airplane in it full of dead people. They crashed the preceding night during the storm and poor visibility. But now the sun is up, the storm is over, the sky's blue, the birds are chirping, and there's no wind. And the investigators, he always thinks if only they had waited, if they had stopped and waited 12 hours, they'd be alive today. The impact on this pilot's listening to him was palpable, myself included. So the last one is take. So now after you've reached the relative safety and you've stopped and you've ceased going into danger, what do you do? And if it's still dangerous to proceed, you stay right where you are. Hard for some people to do. You can spend the night in your car. You'll be there alive in the morning. Think about that NTSB inspector's message. If and only when it is safe, then take the path to your original destination or your new alternative destination. And don't be intimidated or bullied by the views of others or what you imagine their judgments will be of your decision. Listen only to your own good judgment. Your life may depend on it. Now, resolve that you're not going to put yourself in a circumstance where it can be said of you, if only he or she had stopped and waited 12 hours, had pulled off the highway, landed your plane, paused your hike, got off the golf course, and ducked into the clubhouse for an hour while the electrical storm boomed away, and then passed, and then resumed your play. If only. Don't put yourself in a situation where this could be said of your choices, okay? Here, you can add innumerable other scenarios to the innumerable other situations, your future life, where you can imagine yourself in a situation where you are in increasing danger if you proceed. Then, after the red light goes on, imagine yourself decisively and unhesitatingly choosing the exit option to safety. Resolve now never to let it be said about you by your friends, your family, or some poor NTSB or police officer or inspector that if only you had elected to stop and seek safety or chose an alternate route when the red light came on, that you would be alive today. So that is the Red Light broadcast, and something that, digital listeners, if you take this to heart, you will live a longer and safer life.
One thing I'd like to add to that is being prepared. If you're stuck in your car overnight, prepared part might be have some granola bars, have a blanket, have some water in bottled water form, just in case you're stuck in a situation. I often find people like to go places not as prepared as they should, or not as knowledgeable, so they come underprepared to their environment. And I think maybe some of that might lead into crossing this safe light. What do you think about
those
that?
are incredibly good suggestions, Bo. There's a saying among mountain climbers that hypothermia, which is dying of cold, is the killer of the unprepared. Okay. And if you look at all these situations where these people go into trouble, there's you can go into trouble without food, without water. I have a couple of situations I can tell you about that I think were interesting. Just happened to me recently. I was up on Mount Whitney, and this guy I was coming down. I'd summited Mount Whitney, and I was coming down. I was solo climbed, and I got down close to clouds to the trail crest, where this trail comes over 13,000 foot crest of the Sierras and turns up to the summit. And there's this guy who comes up to me, solo climber like me, and says, "You got any water you can spare?" And I was staggered. I said, "No, I'm sorry, I don't." But he tells me he's out of water. And he's going up to the summit. He's not going to stop. It's 2 hours up there and then back down to his. He'll never make it. So I said to him, "Look, it's a lot. There's nobody up there because I just came down, and they could come up from other routes. But it's 2 hours up there. You're never going to make it." And of course, the altitude makes you pant, and that just dehydrates you. And he didn't listen to me. He had. This is a guy. I mean, when I got down, I kept Googling and looking for see what happened. I ever saw anything, but I don't see how he could have gotten back. He was on his way to being a burden to other people, And I was 2 or 3 weeks ago. I was up in the Sierras locally here in Desolation Wilderness with my dog, and we were just doing a little fun thing up there. And I was about 7 miles in Desolation Wilderness, and I made a camp there overlooking this canyon. It was a gorgeous spot, and the sun was setting. And I went over to look at the sunset, and I looked over and I saw somebody on the trail, was a good quarter mile away, see me and then come running up to me. This guy, another solo climber, and he's all agitated. And he says, which is the way out of here? I said, well, where out where? And he says, Wright's Lake, which is where the big parking lot is. And I said, well, I point to it. And can you come and show me? I said, well, there's 2 intersections down here. I don't know which way to go. But they were marked, and the trail is this big trail. Something like, what? So he's so pleading and desperate. So I said, okay, I'll go with you. So I lead him down there, and then I hold up my phone with the app on it that shows the trail and where we are and everything. And he, well, where is it? How do I get there? So I said, it's this way. I said, keep the Sierra peaks here on your left. It's about a 45-degree right angle. Make a right at every intersection you come to. This is a big trail. It'll take you right to the parking lot. But he didn't seem to be. And so I said, well, do you have a map? No. Do you have a compass? No. Do you have an iPhone? No. Do you have an inReach? No. What do you have? He's dead reckoning up there, and he doesn't have any sense of direction, and so he just, the sun had set, and so off he goes into the gloom. I forgot to ask if he had a headlamp, because he had about 15, 20 minutes or 30 minutes of navigable light till it's pitch black dark. You can't walk in that forest without falling on your face, and off he goes, and he's this close to being a litter case, of being lost and being a burden to and who knows. But he was an example of what you were alluding to earlier. He did not inform himself of what you needed to do this. What kind of? It's simple. You can go online and get these apps. They're free, and there's compasses in your iPhone and GPSs, and they will tell you exactly where you are. You can't get lost with that, And there are other more. I have a little inReach. I've showed it to you. You can push it, and it sends out an SOS, and they'll come for you quickly, and they know who you are and exactly where you are. And all really responsible climbers take those, so you don't even need cell coverage. Just push the button and they're coming. And so here's this guy doing what you were just referencing, Bo. He was up there, and he had failed to inform himself or ready himself or prepare himself for the obvious. And it's obvious he wasn't one of those guys who who was comfortable with this. And this is what happens to all these 5 people that die every day in the national parks. They get someplace and they don't know how to get back, and they don't ever, the storms come up. And, I remember climbing Mount Shasta many times, and people show up there with flip-flops on the ice, and a storm comes up and you think, what? They're going to get frostbite. I mean, who knows what's going to happen to them? All of which were just reckless in the information. Know before you go is the thing that the National Park Service, and the National Forest always saying when you get these permits, know before you go. And they have a list of things you click off, and they have a checklist of what you must bring in equipment. But people just don't do that, And so there you're right. Those are being inadequately prepared and inadequately informed and equipped is a probably one of the major decisions, that lead people to get into trouble.
We see all these people on magazines and even documentaries and sport documentaries climbing, and we look at all these beautiful places, but we don't see all the prep that goes into it, and we don't see all of the planning that goes into it necessarily. And these are dangerous places, and a lot of us think, especially like you alluded to earlier, a large segment of the population that crosses the safe line typically end up being a male figure. And we're also known for not asking for directions, and we're also known for all these other things. And sometimes the stereotype fits.
That's really true. And further amplifying that thought, Mount Shasta is this very gentle giant. They call it this gigantic mountain. It's got ice on it, and it's easy to climb relatively if you have crampons. And Mount Whitney has got by one route. Okay, there's a lot of vertical routes, but there's one route. It's 11 miles on a trail to the top. And you could ride a horse to the top, and that ease, leads and lures a lot of people who have no business being up there, and they've never been in the mountains like that before. It leads them to get over their heads, and think that they're okay. And they not realize how the temperature can fall 50 degrees up there in a few hours, and storms can come in, wind can come up. And if they're ill prepared or they get lost, they're not going to make it very long. And the water thing is another example, that you run out of water up there, you're in serious trouble. So the apparent ease of access to some of these places, you don't have to go up some vertical cliff, which would eliminate people. It's just a walk. And they lose sight of just how dangerous it is up there. And that they're, when you're 14,000 plus feet, you're in a different environment that's very unforgiving of mistakes and stupidity, that would not be the case if you were down in a park someplace at sea level.
Does this happen a lot more in tourism season, especially?
Well, it does. It happens first of all, there's something about the highest mountain, okay, Mount Whitney, okay, it gets hundreds of times the traffic that Williamson does. The Williamson's only a few miles away, and it's number 2. But it's number 2. Who wants to climb number 2? I go with the bragging rights. I climbed the highest mountain in the continental United States. And so everybody goes there. And it's the same with a lot of these peaks. They all want to go to the name peak. They want to climb the Grand Teton, they want to do this name peak, so that's part of it. Okay. The other thing is that, they're lured in there by the ease of it, as I was explaining. They can get in there and they can get up high, and they see other people there, and seeing other people there is another disarming thing. That there are people here, so I don't have to look out for myself, and they quickly sometimes can make themselves a rescue thing, become a burden on the whole system. Somebody has to come and get them. And the number of rescues on Whitney is extraordinary. I mean, how many people get up there and they run out of water, or they collapse, or they can't do this and that. And the red light must have been flashing for hours, but they plunged on And here they got themselves in this situation. And there's this false sense that a lot of climbers, inexperienced climbers have that, somebody will save me, somebody will give me water. Somebody will help me down. All I have to do is just pull up my cell phone and somebody's going to materialize and help me down. And when you're way up there, 11 miles up the trail, then it ain't going to happen. You can call in a rescue, but it's going to take a while. So there's this promiscuous sense, I think, in a lot of people that, I don't have to worry. I can just call in a rescue or somebody will help me. And that helps them, that lures them into putting themselves in a situation where their lives could be at risk. And every year people get frostbite up there, they fall, they end up on the snow and they can't, one of the regular killers in the Sierras, besides lightning, is that people walk across these snowfields in the spring, or in summer. And they're packed. The sun has made ice form on the surface of the snow, and you can't penetrate it with your feet. And if you walk out on, you slip, you would just zoom down it to the end, okay? And it kills people all the time, injures them horribly, and they don't have crampons. They don't have these equipment. They don't have an ice axe. They don't know how to use an ice axe. And they walk across the snow thinking they can just stomp their feet in, and next thing you know, the feet fly out from under them and down they go. And I have encountered people like that. One of my first rescue was a woman who was by herself up on Banner Peak in the Sierras, and she was walking across some ice field and slipped. No crampons, no nothing, just flying down this snow field and ran and tumbled into the rocks. And we were walking through, me and two other climbers at Climb Banner were coming down. And just before we go over this little crest we would never hear, I hear this very, very faint, help. And did you hear something? And I said, I didn't hear anything. Go, help. And they all heard it. And so we dashing down toward the sound. And we find this woman with broken ribs, broken arms, broken everything. And she's laying in the snow. And we were just seconds away from going over the hill. And she never would have made it through the night. And so this was the first rescue where I ran down to our camp, get sleeping bags for her. One of my partners stayed with her. The other one ran 13 miles this was back before cell phones, to the parking lot toward the payphone to call in a rescue. They sent a helicopter, landed in the park. I picked him up and came over and dropped him off there, picked her up and took her to the hospital. She was fine. Another time, my son and I were climbing Mount Shasta, and we see these guys, teenagers glissading, which is, sit on your butt and go down the ice, and it was real steep. And we're looking at each other saying, well, that's really steep to be doing that. They don't have any ice anyway. And pretty soon one of them just goes caterwauling into the boulder fields below and is severely injured. So I whip out my cell phone, which is right looking down at Interstate 5, and I call in a rescue. And a few minutes later, a big helicopter goes, they can't find them. And so I steer the helicopter in, they come down, they rescue the guys, And then, I was on Glacier Peak with a guide and another guide, doctor was climbing, we climbed Glacier Peak. And we happened on our third day climbing up, we happened upon this group of like 5 or 6 teenagers that had 2 guides, and they were climbing. I don't know if they were going to actually climb the whole thing or not. And one of the girls that walked over and slid off this thing and then fell down this cliff. And it was so far, I saw where she fell. One of the kids said, one of the guys said there's no way she could have survived that. I mean, she was going to just be dead for them. They hear this deafening thud, and she jumps to her feet right after she landed. She had a hole knocked right through her skull and cerebrospinal fluids coming out and everything. So these guys had in-reaches, okay? Each of these climbs was, the advance of technology had made a huge difference. And so they were rationalizing whether they should call or not. And the doctor and I were furious. I mean, he said, can I look at her? And they said, yes. He goes in, he's this brilliant guy. He says, honey, I'm a doctor. Would you like for me to have a look, And she said, yes, am I going to die? And he gets her a permission. He looks at her. He comes out to these guys out of voicing. She's gravely injured. She has to be rescued now. And these guys were afraid of their liability. I mean, the guys, it was just, so I was the lawyer. I played the lawyer thing. I take them aside and I say, listen, if you don't get on that thing right now, I personally will prosecute you. So they whip out their InReach and they push it. We all huddle around, watch it. It's like a 911 call. It goes up to the International Emergency Rescue Coordination Center in Houston, where they have people speaking 200 languages. They instantly identify the search and rescue, the jurisdiction over that location. And they ask you, what's the nature of your emergency? It's like a 911. So we tell them what's going on. Immediate, serious head injury, teenage girl. And so they say, stand by. And a few minutes later, they come back and they say, a helicopter from that Whitby Air Force Base, Naval Air Station is en route, at your location, 28 minutes, So 28 minutes later, the big helicopter comes in, comes down, picks her up, takes her to land on the roof of Mercy Hospital, downtown Seattle, the trauma center. And they have doctors ready. They take her right down the elevator into surgery. In 20 days, she's back in school, perfectly 100% fixed because of the InReach, and because of this technology and the rescues and the helicopters and all that. We're in a different world today than we were just 20 years ago, and before that, you just stayed up there and till somebody came and caught you, which is usually never.
Let me ask you a question, because that leads me to some ideas that I had. Are there any drone services at these state parks to deliver water to people that are in need? I think
that's a fascinating question. There's a fascinating story in mountaineering journals recently about 3 climbers, I think from Italy, that got lost on K2, second highest mountain in the world. And there was another group that had a drone, and it was a maneuverable drone. And they steered the drone to where these guys were and guided them down because they were going the wrong way. And they didn't bring them water, but they did save their lives, by sending this drone to lead them down. I'm sure that, that's not what I've heard people. They're not set up to bring water because it's kind of heavy and these are light things. But there's no reason why it couldn't be.
They have drones now for Google that are delivering packages. I can't imagine why, we couldn't have something that would service a state park or something like that on standby that would either have water, medical supplies, anything like that, or even search and rescue for that matter. I think that would be a tool that would become invaluable in the future if people.
I think that is just about to happen. I think I read somewhere else where a drone took medical drugs and other bandages like that to an injured climber with people there, and it's not far until we'll have something like that. That would be life-saving.
I think that's great too. It's amazing what technology does, good and bad. So,
yes.
Anything we haven't covered that you'd like to mention before we wrap this up?
Well, I think that, the wilderness is gorgeous and people should spend more time getting outdoors and enjoying it. And it doesn't take a whole lot to be prudent about it. And they should think through those things, what to take, what to do, what not to do. But if you do those things, they're not hard, okay? And you follow and listen to the red light and, follow the rules, you can have a wonderful, wonderful experience outdoors in this incredible wilderness we have in the United States and these beautiful parks. And people should do that and just exercise this caution. And if they take to heart the messages here, it could definitely save their lives and those with them.
Do you want to repeat that acronym before we go, just to leave that imprinted in people's minds?
Sure. It's SAT, which is stop. Okay. And, don't listen to any of these rationales you heard about going on. Just stop. The second is assess your situation carefully. Don't make a precipitous decision. Stop and figure out carefully, rationally. Take some time with it. What is the smart, best, safe thing to do now? And then finally, execute it. Go, back either the way you came or go some alternate route. But if it's necessary to wait for an hour for the lightning or go on a different route because of this, you do that. You execute this new route carefully and prudently. And if you follow all this, your chances of living a longer life have materially increased.
Thank you for sharing that. Well, Robert, thank you once again. This has been a pleasure. you bring a ton of knowledge to the table, and it's always a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you, Bo. I really enjoy it. I look forward to our next one.
Sounds great. You have yourself a great day.
Thank you, sir.
This has been Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany, exploring deep stories from real-life guests with real-life experiences, providing insight to our listeners with every story. Stay up to date on future podcasts by bookmarking Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany.podbean.com and follow Bo on social media by searching Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany. Have an idea for a future story? Send your idea to acrmadison@gmail.com. Until next time, grab life by the horns and keep inspiring others.